So the awakening process can roughly be divided into two phases. The first phase is investigating the nature of identity or the root of identity in consciousness. This culminates in what I usually call awakening or first awakening or Kensho. The second phase of the process involves fully disentangling the paradigm of identity from the sense world, from the actual. And that typically requires more subtle investigations, looking in different places and looking in different ways. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the first phase, which has to do with the nature of self in consciousness, the nature of thought and identity in consciousness. Broadly speaking, this is investigated most simply through self-inquiry. Simple, directed approaches like self-inquiry, one-pointed approach, full immersion into a singular practice can be helpful here because thought tends to be so complex, so heavy, so loud, that the act of focusing our attention, even focusing our will down into one point or one question or one fundamental inquiry can calm the mind enough, can calm all of those waves of struggle and seeking and becoming enough so that we can get to the root of what we take ourselves to be inside consciousness and thought. Often this investigation culminates in a self-validating knowing or knowingness, or a undeniable experience of unbound being, pure consciousness. It's interpreted different ways by different people based on their experience, the way they think, their proclivities. But ultimately, it really comes down to the same thing, and that is we stop perceiving ourself and our world and our experience as a fragmented, endlessly struggling identity or collection of identities even with that are almost born of struggle. That shifts into a knowingness, a place of deep equanimity where it's clearly seen, known, and intuited at the level of our marrow that all of that struggle, all of that need to preserve identity, to know who we are, to preserve who we are, defend who we are, really is nothing but a collection of fleeting thoughts. And we immediately recognize that what we are, or being, unconditioned being, unfiltered being, is simply the nature of aliveness, of being awake, being here, presence. That the piece of this knowingness, the piece of this imperturbable knowingness is uncaused. We don't have to produce it. We really don't even have to remind ourselves of it. This is sometimes interpreted as the pure sense of I, or the pure sense of I am, which isn't the same as a thought I am, or a thought about me as an individual or an entity or a memory. It's the pure knowingness of I amness, of beingness, requiring none of those labels. It's more real than real, more obvious than anything that the thoughts could construct. So with that shift, with that awakening, with that insight, there's a great relaxation. When you consider the contrast between what came before and sort of what comes after this shift, it's probably the biggest shift in one's lifetime. In a sense, there are more profound experiential insights that come later. But while they are more profound, they're also more subtle. And you've also been sort of living in that space of presence, more or less, for a while. So you're sort of ready for the deeper clarifications and so forth. So this first shift is often perceived as a very big deal. It comes with an emotional release, an emotional outflow, a very profound flow state that goes on for quite some time afterward. So then you see and feel the nature of thought and consciousness in a different way. Now, it's funny to talk about this because you may not even think about it as such. You may not use these labels I'm going to use for this, but it doesn't matter, and you know it doesn't matter. You know that the labels don't actually matter. It's the intuition. It's the freedom and the flow state itself that is the teacher. That is what matters. So these terms I'm going to use are pointing to aspects of this experience, but the labels are not that big of a deal. You may think about this differently than I'm labeling it. However, over time, after one has had this first shift, this stuff does start to clarify. It does take some time, or it did for me for sure. It took several years before what actually happened was clear, before what the shift really was about became very clear. So what I want to point to in this talk is that first of all, the relationship between thoughts and consciousness, and what I mean by those, again, more for an intuitive touching in than an instruction or a lecture. But the nature of thought and consciousness, and then how they relate. And then I want to point to a few aspects of what how we navigate unbound consciousness, especially after awakening. And the hope is that by pointing these out, you'll notice in practice, whether it's during meditation or just sitting in silence, or even going about your day, you may notice these aspects help to clarify certain fixations or sticking points inside the thought world or consciousness. So first of all, the simplest way to describe the relationship between thought and consciousness is to say that thought and consciousness are exactly the same thing. A thought isn't an actual thing. It's not something you're ever going to find. In fact, it can be a very good practice to try to find it. So if you have a thought that says whatever thoughts say, boy, I doubt that this whole realization thing is even real, right? When we're in a place of pretty intense doubt, we might second guess everything, right? Like, I don't even know who I am, or maybe this is all a lie, or the sneaking fears that creep up, the doubts. But you can take any one of those thoughts, you can just grab it and say, okay, well, there's a thought here that says maybe everything is a lie, maybe my whole life is a lie, whatever these thoughts say. And just notice, okay, there's a thought that says that, seems to have that narrative, but how do I even know that thought is there, right? Like, how do I know an object in front of my face is there? An apple, I could pick it up, I could reach out and pick it up, I can look at the color of it, I can manipulate it, I could hand it to someone else. So in the same way, if we just take an empirical approach to thought, what is a thought? How do you know it's there? What is your evidence that that thought even exists, or that it's purveying the story or narrative that it seems to be purveying? And the idea with doing this is not to think about it some more. It's not to conceptualize, right? It's not to go, well, I've read that a thought is a symbolic, blah, 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 and remembering something we've read on Wikipedia or something we learned in psychology or whatever. That's not the point of what I'm talking about. I mean, to literally look empirically at what the thought actually is right now, just like you would with an apple, right? If I say, how can you prove that there's an apple in front of you? You probably pick it up and show it to me or hand it to me. But can you pick a thought up in the same way? What is it like when you move toward a thought, right? These kind of practices can be very valuable. So again, the thought can be anything. It can be an image thought. It can be a memory of you doing something, having a conversation. So when you reach into that space, whatever that space is, if it's space that thought seems to arise in, what do you find? You can do this anytime. You can do it right now. You can do it during meditation. It seems to be somewhat different than the external world. Yeah. You can't pick it up and grab it in the same way. In fact, I don't want to give away any answers, because I would prefer that anyone listening to this would actually take up the investigation themselves. But I would argue that it's quite the opposite. The closer you look, the less that's there. And this is the funny thing about thought, that it's not a physical object, right? It seems to be there, and it seems to have a lot of influence on us. But strangely, the more attention we give it, the closer we look at it, the less weight it has, the less solid it feels, the less sure we can even be that is even anything at all. Is there even anything there? How do I know the story of that thought again? Like, when I'm looking right at it, I can't find it. I can't find the narrative now. It's like a mist, and the closer you look at the mist, the less mist is there. It just starts to dissipate itself. So that's one simple approach to looking into the nature of thought and what a thought is. But for this lecture, for this talk, I'm just going to simply state that a thought is not a solid thing. It's not a solid object. And you can reasonably easily find that out by just investigating. And there is value to continuing to investigate, even once you've seen that, oh, wow, I can't really find a thought. It's easy to just notice that and then just go down a thought train about something else, or you can keep looking. And it is valuable to keep looking, to keep penetrating into that space of thought. What is that? What is it made out of? Notice that it's kind of mysterious to do this, and it starts to almost come to a place of neutrality. That in and of itself can be quite a valuable practice. You can just do this ongoing without having to make any conclusions. But as I said, for this talk, I just wanted to point out that a thought is not an object. It's not a physical object. It's not something fixed in time and space so much as it's an activity. Thinking really is an activity, especially when we're mind identified, which means we're so enraptured in thought that we become less acutely aware of the outside world, of the senses. When that's happening, there's a certain polarity that gets set up inside consciousness, meaning the sense of being a thinker even becomes obscured. You literally just feel like you're living in a thought world. It doesn't feel like a thought world. It feels like the world, but it's made out of thoughts. And the thinker, the sense of being a thinker even starts to disappear. And it can almost become like a hyper real experience. But the thing I want to point out about this is that you stop becoming aware that you're aware of thoughts, right? That's when the seeming thought world actually seems to replace the real world. And this is how we become hypnotized by thought, and how many of us find ourselves there, uh, and find it to be very uncomfortable. And that is what leads us to this investigation that we're talking about. And it's the mechanism that takes a critical hit with awakening. It doesn't go away completely, but it does break down in a very real way. And then we suddenly recognize that the thinker, the thought, the activity of thinking, all of that is nothing but movements inside of this vastness of being and consciousness. So thinking, so a thought is not a thing as much as a verb or an activity. And it requires a couple of it requires a couple of activities that go on inside of consciousness that we're not aware of as such, until we really do this investigation and start to become more aware of it. But one of these mechanisms, one of these activities that's required, is that there's a sense of subject object. There's the thinker and the thought. But again, if you're just sitting there contemplating something, daydreaming, thinking, you'll notice you're identified with the thinker, meaning you're identified with the subject. You're looking from its point of view. So when you're daydreaming about life, you're usually looking from a point of view as if you're looking out of your own eyes. But that's not actually happening, right? Those thoughts aren't happening. They're either memories or imaginings of the future. But the point of view appears to be you, right? That's why we take the subject to be who we are, to the point where we're so absorbed in the subjectivity that we don't notice there's a subject anymore at all. So again, it's the hypnosis of thought to where it feels like we're in a real world that is not actually happening right now. So that polarity, that subject object split in consciousness is required for us to remain identified in thoughts, to allow that activity of thinking to continue to just propagate itself. Now, again, we don't consciously do this. We don't choose to, okay, I'm going to become a subject to the object of thought, and I'm going to turn the movie on, the projector of thinking, and I'm just going to get lost in thought. We don't decide to do that. It actually happens pretty automatically. However, once we calm the mind enough, once we've had some insights, we start to see that there are ways that we're perpetuating it, but they're hard to see, especially when the mind is very active. It's hard to see where and how we're doing that. So by pointing these mechanisms out, my goal really is to just give a sense of how that might be happening, and you might notice it in your experience. And later in the talk, I'll talk about sort of meditative approaches to undo these tendencies, or these mechanisms that are keeping that thinking experience going. So one of them is polarity. It's subject object. I have to be the one watching the screen on which all of the thoughts are playing out that look like whatever, narrative or storyline or et cetera, et cetera. A lot of it is memories. So there's a subject object experience in consciousness. Now, I'm going to use a model of consciousness. And again, this is this model will be a thought in your mind. And yet I don't intend for it to remain conceptual. It's something you can sort of feel into. And if you ever hear about taking the backward step, this is what I'm pointing to. And that is consciousness. You could almost imagine like a three-dimensional fluid or gas that's like homogeneous. It takes up all the space. It takes up space in every direction. So like everywhere you look, there's this homogeneous substance of whatever, fluid. It's fluid. And it doesn't have things in it. It's clear, and it has one quality, let's say, and that quality is knowingness or awareness. It's aware. It has the ability to be aware. And it's without activity, without subject object split, without becoming a subject watching a movie screen of objective thoughts inside of this consciousness. The consciousness is just still. It's a still fluid that's purely knowing. It knows only itself in a sense. It has a an infinite spaciousness of that knowing. The fact that it's not bound into an object of thought makes it so that that knowingness transmits infinitely through itself. Okay. It's like a light that could shine on anything to illuminate that object, but it doesn't have to. It can actually shine into itself so that there's only light. Okay. And when you experience it that way, that's pure consciousness or unbound consciousness, undivided consciousness. This is the ocean, and a thought is the wave. A narrative is the wave. You've heard that you're the ocean and the wave and that sort of thing. But this model I'm pointing to is something you can definitely directly experience. And often not often, but ultimately what happens is when identity shifts such that we stop taking ourselves to be any particular wave or any particular dualistic construct inside of consciousness, and just the light of knowing, the light of being that's been there ever since you've been aware, is regained. It's remembered. Identity falls back into a much more vast experience of being, and that's it. It's a very, very simple act. It's a very simple happening, but it's critically important for this process to sort of propagate. So from that place, from that knowing of the pure light of knowing, of pure being without having to be something, without having to become, but just be, this pure conscious state, there's not a need for creating a subject and object split. There's not a need to become a thinker thinking about a thought object, meaning anything, a narrative, images in the mind. That's not necessary for consciousness to be there. And that's something that's overlooked until we really have access to this consciousness in an undivided way. So we feel compelled to continue to be the thinker. We feel compelled to solve the problems that keep coming up on that screen of thought by using more thought. We believe we're going to think our way out of the discomfort that arises from constant thinking. Yeah. So we're actually, unbeknownst to ourselves, introducing a little bit of will to keep that polarized nature of consciousness ongoing, if that makes sense. It doesn't take much at all, actually, because I think our nervous systems are just wired such that the momentum of neural pathways kind of stays going. But we do introduce this will, based on a belief in separation. I'm separate from the world out there. I'm separate from my thoughts, etc. We introduce this sense of subject object. So that's one aspect or one mechanic that keeps this this thinking machine going. Another one is they're all interrelated, but another one is points to the equanimity aspect, and that is that we have a reactivity inside of consciousness that's somewhat like ripples on a pond. You know, if you tap the surface of the water, the ripples just kind of keep propagating. And then if they bounce back off an object and you think that something else caused those ripples, you'll try to ripple it again to stop the ripples, and it just multiplies the ripples. This is what we're doing inside consciousness. This is the pushing and pulling we do with really what feels like our life. We think it's our life that we're pushing and pulling on, but we're really pushing and pulling on consciousness. And it does not, especially before awakening, especially, it takes very, very little pushing and pulling to propagate these waves of dualistic experience in consciousness, of struggle, of seeking, of, you know, you feeling certain and then feeling completely uncertain, of feeling like you know where you are and then feeling completely lost. And because we don't have an instinctual knowing of this unbound nature of being, we tend to actually introduce even more will inside consciousness, in thought. This, again, for me, was what was so incredibly uncomfortable as I became a thinking adult, that I had to wake up. Like, it was just torture. Like, the more I pushed, the more I thought, the more I tried to think my way out of thinking, the worse it got. And it was just very uncomfortable. So after a shift, after we really do have access to that unbound consciousness or pure being or I am sense, by just resting in that, there's a natural calming of that pushing and pulling, of that stretching the rubber band this way and that way, of thinking that we can control experience by thinking about it harder or in a different way. And intuitively, we learn to just calm down, and less ripples in the pond makes it much easier to remember that we're the whole pond or the whole ocean, rather than the next ripple that's coming and what I have to do to defend myself against it. So so those are two aspects that we become aware of when we become more and more familiar with the quality of unbound being, and that is consciousness. That is just us being awake. That is polarity, subject-object experience, being a subject or subjectifying, pulling back from, and seeing the object of whatever seems like my life that's made out of thoughts, and the reactivity, the equanimity aspect, which is equanimity is the opposite of reactivity, but the reactivity is the pushing and pulling, feeling like I have to manage everything. I have to push and pull, which is sort of based on the belief that that objective thought world is something other than just a reflection inside consciousness. And the third aspect, and these again are all interrelated, and the third aspect is really just a reminding of ourself that certainly at this stage, that identity, or what we are, at least to the degree that we can know it in any way at all, is this unbound being. It's this knowingness. There's nothing else. There's nothing else to identity. I'll say it that way. And thus we can give ourselves permission to just rest in it. So it can be a very good practice to just rest in the sense of I am, as Nisargadatta Ramana Maharishi described. Ramana Maharishi said to inquire into the source of the I am thought, and to rest in that sense of I am. So this is a wonderful practice if you can do it, if it makes sense intuitively, where we don't need to grab onto any thought, and we don't need to reject any thought. And when we're sitting in this, and this is typically a meditative practice, but you could begin to sense it outside of meditation for sure. But if we're engaging this as a meditative practice, it's just pure simplicity, the pure light of awakeness, beingness, no need for labels. Any movement of thought is nothing but a movement in consciousness, and as consciousness, it's as what you are. So there's no need to grab onto it, identify it, label it, push it, pull it. This resting in the pure sense I am is really valuable. And in and of itself, it can really take you a long way, perhaps even to liberation. Because when you rest in this I am sense, in this pure being sense, again, the labels do drop away. So when the I am label drops away, or even the I label drops away, and you may even perceive that I am, if I am anything, I am everything. Like anything I've ever thought is here. It's a version of this consciousness. Anything I've ever thought about, anything I've ever perceived, anything about the seeming external world I can know is a form of consciousness. And thus, I am already that. I am that, as Nisargadatta said. So resting there, not needing to push or pull on thought or subjectify or label anything, can be a very valuable practice. And as we practice in this way, if we do, we can take notice of these other two aspects that I described. The pushing and pulling. As a thought starts to arise, as a thought form starts to stir, we can notice if I push on it or if I pull on it, I sort of inflate it into a concept, into something more real. If I take a neutral stance with it, meaning I'm not pushing and pulling, I'm not in front or behind it, then it's as if I'm the whole of the ocean and I'm also the wave, but the wave never really leaves the ocean. It's just it's sort of moving and standing still at the same time. So again, these are subtle things I'm pointing to, but if you can intuit them a little bit and sort of put them into practice, hold them very gently, of course, in practice, because to rest in the sense of I am, if it's very calm and very quiet, there's none of this going on. You don't need to do anything really. It's more of a noticing that this equanimity of consciousness is a natural quality of consciousness. And it arises as a knowing that there's no need to stir the thought soup. Just let the thoughts coalesce, move as they will. And what you find when you don't push or pull, when you don't add or subtract, don't introduce will at all, no matter what the form of thought it seems to be arising, they arise less and less. In fact, they almost don't even arise. In fact, sometimes they don't form at all. And it's just pure I am, pure, the pure being. And the interesting thing is you might wonder, and thoughts like to co-opt things and pull you back in by saying, well, how will you know that unless you think about it? Well, the weird thing about it is when it comes to pure consciousness or pure I am sense, the one thing you damn well know better than anything, more clearly than you've ever known any thought, is that you know this without thinking about it. So there you go. It's the most obvious thing. You don't have to think. You don't have to think about it to confirm it. That's the key. It's that obvious. It's that more real than real. It's just self-validating is the best phrase I have for that. So yeah, you don't actually have to think to confirm that you're quote unquote in this place because you've never left it. In a sense, when you're awake, it's always there. But there's no need to stir up thought to confirm anything. You don't have to self-reflect. You don't have to confirm the subject, right? Because the subject is expanded into infinity. Everything is the subject in a sense. Everything is I. And this is one of those things I repeat again and again in different ways. And just because it's the nature of thought, the thought will automatically try to model this at first until you start to just notice, oh, the modeling of this paradigm itself is a thought. That's not what he's pointing to, and it's not, but it's a side effect sort of. But I noticed like I'll point to it again and again, and then it's always fascinating because at some point, most people will just go, oh my God, I know exactly what you mean now. I totally get it. It's obvious, and it's obvious to me that it's obvious to them in that moment. So if it's not clear, there are ways to continue to just dig in a little bit, right? Self-inquiry, try to get back to the subject. If you notice this phenomenon I'm describing of when I'm thinking, when there are thoughts there about whatever, the past or the future, which are clearly thoughts because the past and future aren't here right now, never seen it, right? So they're always thoughts, past or future thoughts, image thoughts, narrative thoughts. When those thoughts are there, that's fine. It's fine that they're there. Turn around and try to find the subject. Look for the thinker. They got to be about someone, right? They seem to be. They say they are. This is how Ramana Maharishi kind of describes it. To whom did this thought arise? That's what you want to look for. Don't think about who I am. Look back experientially in your experience, in your internal experience, and try to find the subject. And you may notice pretty quickly you can't actually find the subject, but don't just intellectually conclude it can't be found. That's not the end goal, right? Because then that's a thought. Keep looking until the exquisitely clear, undeniable knowing clicks, and it will. And there's no way to tell you how that happens, because it's paradoxical. It's already there, of course, but to just believe it's already there doesn't help you. You have to keep looking for it until something just turns over, just clicks into place. Alternatively, sometimes you just exhaust yourself. In Zen, it's a lot like that, with Renzai Zen at least, looking into the koan mu. What is mu? There's no way you're going to solve that intellectually. It's impossible. You can't even get started on it intellectually. And yet there's a solution for that question. There's a end game to asking that question. And it often comes from exhaustion, in the sense that you sort of exhaust yourself mentally, and you may even do sesshin and you exhaust yourself physically, but you keep asking, what is mu? What the hell could it be? What is it? Where is it? Until it's just mu, just mu, nothing but. Then you don't even, it's just an impulse at some point, but you don't separate from it. They don't separate. It's almost like an obsession, and you hold on, stay as close as you can to that, to mu. Don't separate until the mind just gets quieter and quieter and quieter. It's that one-pointed approach. And then sometimes it just hits you like, there's no way I can solve this. It's impossible to solve as who I'm taking myself to be. Impossible, because who I'm taking myself to be is a thought. And then boom, that's it. So, but you can't think your way into that. You have to work your way into that. You have to really inquire, keep looking, find your natural point of inquiry, find a way to turn back and find that subject that seems to be the one all of this is happening to, the one that's doing all the inquiry, practicing, searching, seeking, whether it's practical seeking or spiritual seeking. Who's doing all that? Where is it? Can I find it? And if in that finding, in that seeking, the mind becomes very, very quiet, that's fine. Stay right there. Don't move. That's fine.